So welcome to the learning series. We're going to be continuing on looking at the new questions uh, for the new basic course, basic questions from ISED. Today we're covering sections 116 to 120. Next week we'll cover the last part of regulations, and then we'll be moving on to some of the more technical topics coming up. Um, so the left side is the actual exam question. On the right side is the summary of the materials, and any new material or new questions is in bold. So we're on number one, rules and regulations. So today we're doing 16 to 20, and then next week we'll do 21 to 25, which will finish off this section. So today we'll talk about bandwidths and bands, power levels, unmodulated retransmissions, modulation and modes, and ITU. So one of the things here is that when you transmit a signal, let's say you set your frequency to 7 megahertz on your radio. Your signal is not going to be just at 7 megahertz. You have to add on the amount of your bandwidth, and that's going to depend on what kind of modulation you're using. So for the 6 meter and 12 and 2 meter band, the bandwidth is limited to 30 kilohertz. If you're doing it from 28 to 29, which is the 10-meter band, you're limited to 20 kilohertz bandwidth. If you're doing, in general, if you're going from 7 megahertz to 25 megahertz, the general bandwidth that you're allowed is 6 kilohertz, except for one band, which we'll get into in a second. Maximum bandwidth on VHF, 144 to 148, is 30 kilohertz. So typically for HF, it's 6 kilohertz or less, and then around the 30 kilohertz mark, it's 20 kilohertz, and then higher up is 30 kilohertz for the VHF bands. So for 50 to 54 megahertz, which is the 6 meter band, the limit here again is 30 kilohertz. So over here it describes which bands fall into where. And then which of the following amateur bands has a maximum allowed bandwidth of less than 6 kilohertz? And that would be your 10 to 10.1 to 10.15. That's your 30-meter band. So here, because the range is very small, your bandwidth has to be less than 6 kilohertz. So this is limited to CW and to digital modes only. No voice or single sideband on that band. So here's the question. Which band are you not allowed to use single sideband? And that would be the number D, which is your CW digital band, your 30-meter band. So no single sideband on that. What precaution must an amateur radio operator take when transmitting near the band edges? So what happens is, if you're close to the band edge, your bandwidth will fall outside the frequency that you're allowed to transmit on. So then you're interfering with the person that happens to be in the next band plan. So you have to make sure that not to operate close to the end, the bandwidth, so that your bandwidth is within the allowed range of the band edges. Here's another one. Based on the frequency stated and the emission mode, which of the following combinations is prohibited? So when you look at this, You're allowed to do FT8 on 14 meters, 14 megahertz. You're allowed to do CW on 10 megahertz. You're allowed to do fast scan TV or ATV on 440 megahertz, but you're not allowed to do fast scan TV, ATV on 145 megahertz. So this one is prohibited. So there's several questions like this coming up. Here's another one. Based on the frequency stated and the emission mode, which of the following combinations is prohibited? So again, 3.76, you're allowed to do single sideband. 29.6, you're allowed to do FM. Slow scan TV or SSTV, you can do on 14 megahertz, but you're not allowed to do ATV on HF. So fast scan TV is not allowed on 14.23 megahertz. Here's another one, similar type of question, based on the frequency stated and the emission modes, which of the following is prohibited? So again, FT8 on 10 megahertz is allowed. Morse code on 10 megahertz is allowed. FM is allowed on 29.6. So then single sideband is not allowed on 10.12 because that's the CW digital band only. And now we get into power limits. So there's typically two ways to measure power. One is the output of your amplifier or transmitter using an RF meter, or the other way is to measure the DC input going into your amplifier or your transceiver. And in the older days, it was easier to measure the DC current or the DC power going into a transceiver than to measure the RF output. So there's two ways of doing it. So what transmitter power should Canadian amateur radio operators use at all times? So you should be using the minimum legal power necessary to communicate. For single sideband operation, what is the maximum transmitted peak envelope power for an amateur radio station that holds a certificate with an advanced one? So in this case, the answer is B for single sideband, and if you hold the advanced certification, you're allowed 2250 watts. So here's another question. You have determined that the maximum transmitted power that meets RF exposure and radiated power limits. Where do you verify the power is not exceeded? So in most cases, you measure the output at the transmitter or at the external amplifier. So B is the answer. For single sideband on 3750 kilohertz, what is the maximum transmitted peak envelope power that an amateur radio operator that holds a basic and Morse code can transmit? So in this case, because they don't hold an advanced, it drops from 2250 down to 560 watts. So C is the correct answer. Here's another one for single sideband on 7.05 kilohertz. What is the maximum peak envelope power for someone holding the basic qualification and honors? Now, in terms of power levels, there's no difference between basic or basic with honors or CW, so it remains at 560 watts. So C is the correct answer. Here's a new question. What is the maximum effective radiated power, ERP, expressed as a peak envelope power the holder of an amateur radio certificate with advanced qualification may be used on 60 meters? So 60 meters is a special band where you actually have channels. So you have, I think, 6 channels at 5 megahertz. Most of the channels are used for military purposes, except amateur radio is allowed to use 2 of the channels. And in this case, you have to look at effective radiated power. So what's actually coming out of the antenna. And then here for this particular band at 60 meters, the limit is 100 watts. So this is a special case. Here's another question. What is the maximum allowed DC input power to the final RF stage of an amateur radio transmitter with an operator that holds advanced qualification? So in this case, it would be DC input would be 1,000 watts. So D would be the correct answer. Here's a new question. So there are some new bands, the medium frequency band and the low frequency band, which is 630 meters and 22 meters. And in this case, you have to look at the isotropic radiated power, the effective isotropic radiated power based on an isotropic antenna. Which in Siri, which it doesn't exist practically, but exists in Siri. So in this case, what's important with the limit is you have to take into account the gain of the antenna. Here's a couple more questions. So here again, what is the maximum DC power to the final amplifier stage with someone holding a basic qualification? So in this case, it's 250 watts. So DC input for basic would be 250 watts. And here's another question. Unless an operator holds an amateur radio certificate with advanced qualification, what is the maximum carrier power that an amateur radio station may use on emissions other than single sideband? So in this case, it would be C, which would be 190 watts. So the limit would be 190 watts. This is somewhat of a tricky question. This is like a double negative, unless an operator holds an advance and they're not operating on single sideband. So what is the maximum power? So it's 190 watts. So now we get to the next section, which deals with unmodulated and retransmission. So what kind of amateur radio station automatically retransmits the signals of other stations? So, it's receiving a signal and then transmitting it again. So it would be a repeater station. An unmodulated carrier may be transmitted only. So C is the answer for brief tests on frequencies below 30 megahertz. So if you're doing some brief testing, you can do an unmodulated carrier below 30 megahertz. What is the lowest output frequency of repeaters that holders of an amateur radio operator certificate only with basic qualifications are allowed to use? So here you would look at here you would look at this answer here. So the answer would be C, 29.5 megahertz. What is the lowest output frequency band segment of repeaters that holders of an amateur radio license with only a basic qualification are allowed to use? So that would be A, 29.5 to 29.7 megahertz. So now we get into modulation modes. What do Canadian regulations stipulate regarding frequency stability in amateur radio service? So the answer here is it must be equivalent to crystal control below 148 megahertz. So they want something that is quite stable, and it's related to crystal control. When is the following emission modes requires an amateur radio station have means to prevent or indicate overmodulation? So you're going to get overmodulation when you use single sideband. So you have to be careful you don't overmodulate the signal. Amateur radio stations are required to have a means of indicating or preventing a signal quality problem unique to voice transmission. What is it? Again, when you're doing voice, you can get overmodulation, so the answer is B. So what is the maximum percentage of modulation permitted for amateur radio operator voice communications? So here you're allowed 100% modulation for voice. What must all amateur radio stations be capable of reliably measuring regardless of emission mode? So the most important one of all of these things is C, which is frequency. What is the maximum percentage modulation permitted for amateur radio voice communication? So again, they ask the same question. So it's C, 100%. Now we get into ITU. What types of messages may be transmitted to an amateur radio station in a foreign country? And again, it's messages related to the purposes of amateur radio or remarks of a personal nature. And then B, question 2, the amateur radio station operator shall ensure that B, international communications are limited to purposes of amateur radio or remarks of a general nature. Remember, you're not allowed to do any business on amateur radio. Which of the following is a provision of the International Telecommunication Union's radio regulation that applies to Canadian radio operators? So here, the answer is B. International communications are permitted unless there is an administration that has registered an objection. So that would be like a foreign country, government registering an objection that they don't want people to communicate with them, and they would have to file that with the ITU. Here's a new question. What do the International Telegraph Union's radio regulation prescribe regarding proficiency in Morse code? So administrations determine if proficiency in Morse code is a requirement for authorization. So that basically means that the country's administration determines if there's a Morse code requirement or not. Here's another question. Canadian amateur radio operators must comply with the Radio Communication Act and the Radio Communication Regulations. What other organization issues radio regulations that Canadian amateur radio operators must comply with? So here again, the answer would be B, the International Telecommunications Union. So the ITU is the big body that covers the world, and then you have the Government of Canada, which is administered by the ISED, where you have the Radio Communication Act and the Radio Communication Regulations. And that's it for that section. Not too many new questions, so we'll finish off rules and regulations next week. So let me just stop the recording.